Welcome to This Explainer. Today, we're unpacking the hidden, somewhat messy psychological mechanics behind toxic workplace behaviors. Look, if you've ever wondered why brilliant professionals sometimes totally self-destruct under stress, or maybe how to handle a highly manipulative colleague without completely losing your mind, you're definitely in the right place. Today, we're equipping you with neuroscience-backed defensive strategies so you can actually survive and thrive in high-pressure environments. Let's get into it.
So let's kick things off with a slightly counterintuitive question. Think about the absolutely best leaders you know. Now picture them on their absolute worst day. Why is it that our greatest leadership strengths suddenly become our absolute worst liabilities the second we're pushed to our limits? It's a really fascinating paradox, and to answer it, we have to look closely at both our biology and our behavioral psychology.
To get to the bottom of this, here's our roadmap for today. We're going to cover the brain under pressure, identifying derailers, team-level toxicity, amygdala regulation, the gray rock defense, and finally, collective resilience.
All right, starting with part one, the brain under pressure. We've got to look at the biology of stress.
You see, to truly understand workplace toxicity, we first have to understand the hard biological reality of how the human brain processes intense stress. And the absolutely crucial concept here is the amygdala hijack. Deep inside your brain is this tiny almond-shaped cluster of neurons called the amygdala. It is literally your evolutionary threat detection center. The crazy thing is, in a high-pressure situation, your amygdala cannot distinguish between an emotional threat to your ego, like getting harshly critiqued in a boardroom, and a physical threat to your life. When it gets triggered, it floods your entire body with stress hormones and practically disables your rational, logical prefrontal cortex, milliseconds before you can even process what's happening.
Now, think about what this means for leaders specifically. When we are emotionally hijacked, we are essentially driving blind. We're out of control. And as a leader, your potential to do severe collateral damage is massively magnified by the power you wield. You can literally destroy a team's psychological safety in a matter of seconds when that primitive part of the brain takes the wheel.
Moving right along to section 2, identifying leadership derailers. This is what psychologists call the dark side of personality.
Let's look at how this biological stress response actually shows up in our daily professional behavior. The Hogan Development Survey identifies what they call derailers. But here's the catch. These aren't just inherent character flaws. They are literally your greatest strengths operating in overdrive because you've stopped self-monitoring due to stress or fatigue. Take a diligent leader, for instance. Normally, they're highly productive, super detail-oriented, a great asset. But you add massive stress into the mix, and suddenly, that diligence morphs into intense micromanaging, rigid perfectionism, and a total inability to delegate. It's the same trait, just gone rogue.
The Hogan model actually groups 11 of these derailers into 3 distinct stress response clusters. We either move away, move against, or move toward our stressors. For example, an excitable leader moves away from pressure by riding these volatile emotional peaks and valleys. A bold leader moves against pressure, reacting with arrogance and totally dismissing feedback. And then you have the dutiful leader, who moves toward the source of pressure, becoming incredibly eager to please their superiors while completely ignoring the needs of their own team. Knowing which cluster you fall into is a game changer because each one requires a very specific strategic countermove to manage.
Okay, section 3, team-level toxicity and shared derailers.
So we know what happens to an individual, right? But what happens when an entire group of leaders shares the exact same derailer? At the organizational level, shared derailers fundamentally shape collective decision-making. Imagine a senior team that shares the cautious derailer. Under stress, their collective risk aversion just amplifies off the charts. Meetings become highly polarized, psychological safety totally erodes, and vital transformation initiatives just grind to a sudden, painful halt. Because everyone is collectively defensive and terrified of making a mistake. It's organizational paralysis. But hey, it's not all doom and gloom. The data actually shows that actively addressing these toxic patterns works beautifully. There's this one remarkable case study of a retail chain where HR brought in emotional intelligence coaching for a highly critical, borderline toxic manager. By just helping this person understand their derailers and learn to self-regulate, the company saw a massive 20% drop in employee turnover, plus a 30% boost in team satisfaction in that region. That is real, measurable impacts. Which brings us to section 4, amygdala regulation and our defensive tactics. Knowing the sheer damage these derailers can cause, how do we actually protect ourselves and our teams from getting sucked into these destructive stress loops? Well, Defensive emotional intelligence relies heavily on something called state shifting. It's a simple but ridiculously powerful four-step tactical sequence. Step one is absolutely crucial. Name it. By just mentally saying to yourself, I am triggered right now, you instantly wake up your rational adult self. You'll probably still feel the stress, sure, but your neocortex is suddenly back online. Then you take space. You shift your physical state, and only then do you actually deal with the situation.
Now, taking space, that doesn't mean you have to dramatically storm out of a boardroom, slamming the door behind you. It can be a highly strategic, incredibly indirect approach. Think about a perfectly timed bathroom break, or just buying time by saying, that's an interesting suggestion. Let me run some numbers and get back to you on that tomorrow. You are essentially putting up a vital firewall between your triggered amygdala and your outward actions.
Once you've safely bought yourself that space, it's time to deploy tools that speed up the recovery of your nervous system. This could be a few minutes of deep breathing, maybe some progressive muscle relaxation, a bit of self-reflection, or honestly, even just finding a sense of humor about your own ridiculous triggers. The whole goal is to consciously shift your energy back to a state of balance, so your rational brain is fully back in the driver's seat. All right, Section 5, the gray rock defense. This is all about shielding against manipulation. But what if the stress isn't just an internal reaction? What if it's being actively and intentionally inflicted on you by a highly manipulative or narcissistic colleague? Enter the gray rock method. This is a behavioral shield where you intentionally make yourself so thoroughly boring, neutral, and emotionally unresponsive that you quite literally resemble a gray rock. Narcissists and manipulators absolutely feed on dramatic emotional reactions. By keeping your responses incredibly brief, sticking only to the facts, and stripping out all emotion, you starve them of the fuel they crave. Eventually, they just lose interest and move on to someone else. It's a total game changer.
Now, you absolutely have to keep in mind the hidden cost of this defense. There's a huge difference between cognitive gray rock and somatic gray rock. Cognitively, sure, you might be successfully saying the exact right neutral words with a perfectly flat tone. But somatically, your nervous system is likely still running a full-blown fret response. Your body is flooding with cortisol, your jaw is super tense, your heart is racing. Because your body is absorbing all that physiological stress in the moment, you absolutely must engage in some sort of physical discharge later, like a heavy workout or therapy. Otherwise, you are on a fast track to severe burnout.
Finally, Section 6, collective resilience, where we fortify the entire organization. Let's zoom out to the macro picture here. How can we fortify our entire organization against both our own internal derailers and these external manipulative threats? We build a deeply resilient workforce by institutionalizing healthy boundaries. This means establishing crystal clear team norms, openly identifying each other's strengths and weaknesses, and most importantly, normalizing the pause before taking action. Look, in toxic cultures, everything is treated like a 5-alarm fire. By creating a culture that actually rewards slowing down and verifying facts, you instantly break that cycle of artificially induced urgency that manipulators love to use to force bad decisions. Ultimately, mastering these high-pressure environments takes profound patience and rock-solid emotional regulation. I think it's beautifully captured by this ancient piece of wisdom from Lao Tzu. Do you have the patience to wait till your mud settles and the water is clear? Think about it. In business, that muddy water, that's your triggered amygdala. You just have to wait for it to settle. So I want to leave you with this one vital question to really reflect on before you step into your next high-stakes meeting or confront that difficult colleague. Are you consciously leading with your strengths right now, or have the pressures of the environment allowed your derailers to grab the wheel? Thank you so much for joining me for this explainer. And remember, simple awareness is always the very first step to taking back control. Catch you next time.